In 1906, Charleston, South Carolina, the clerk responsible for daily admissions at Kingsbridge Asylum arrived to find the front registry desk scorched black, its iron lockbox pried open, and every patient record from the previous 21 years gone without a trace. The fire had not spread beyond the single room, yet no alarms were raised, and no witnesses came forward. Dr. Cornelius Brandt, the asylum's superintendent, stood in his garden that morning with ash dusting his shoulders, and no explanation but a locked greenhouse door behind him. Brandt was known for his surgical precision, always in polished boots and a narrow-lens monocle, and for keeping the facility unusually isolated from city inspectors. In early 1906, Charleston was grappling with reconstruction debts, erratic municipal oversight, and a sweltering summer that sent sour rot wafting from the harbor up through the city. A March ledger entry noted 163 resident patients, yet no census since has confirmed their whereabouts. Why were these records erased, and who ensured they would never resurface? Kingsbridge Asylum had long been praised for its quiet efficiency, its Greek revival wings and manicured grounds suggesting order and dignity, while staff uniforms bore a faint trace of lavender soap. But a misplaced inventory sheet dated May 14, 1906, listed 4 identical patient entries under different names, each marked unfit for relocation, prompting a city clerk to request access and vanish from the registry herself. On the morning of April 3, 1906, Mrs. Harriet Tolleson opened the shutters of her boarding house just across the marsh from Kingsbridge Asylum. She was a widow in her late 50s, known in the neighborhood for her punctual deliveries of sweet rolls to the post office. That day, however, she stood still longer than usual, her eyes fixed on the distant chimney of the asylum, where a thin column of smoke rose steadily against the morning light. She later described it as not like a kitchen fire nor anything natural. It was pale and mean. It didn't waver. The next day, a letter arrived at City Hall. The handwriting was uneven, the ink smudged at the edges as if written in haste. It bore no return address. Inside was a single line. Dr. Brandt has locked the West Wing, and no one has seen the night nurse since Tuesday. The envelope was stamped in Charleston's District 5, the route that serviced the asylum grounds and the surrounding farmland. The West Wing, known formerly as Ward 6, had once housed patients with non-verbal afflictions, a term used in the asylum's classification ledgers to describe those who did not speak, either by choice or inability. At the turn of the century, the practice of institutionalizing such individuals was not uncommon, and Charleston's civic leaders took pride in Kingsbridge for handling difficult cases without scandal. But Ward 6 had always been kept at a distance from the other units, connected by a covered walkway and secured by a black-painted gate. The missing nurse, Ms. Eleanor Vassey, was last listed on the staff payroll dated March 27, 1906. A clerk later testified during a municipal review that her pay was not collected that week, nor had she signed the daily logbook. No family claimed her absence, and no city paper reported it. Still, her name remained faintly penciled in on a patient medication ledger, where she had initialed doses for rooms 12, 15, and 18, each entry abruptly stopping on the evening of March 30th. That same week, Thomas Beringer, a coal deliveryman for Gadsden and Sons, filed an informal complaint with the district office. He reported being denied entry to the asylum's rear yard, where he had for 5 years routinely delivered barrels of coal every Friday morning. He described the new staff member who turned him away as tall, expressionless, and in a smock too clean for a coal yard. The gate was chained shut behind the man, though the weather had turned unusually cold and the kitchens would have required fuel. Not even a dog barked, Beringer wrote. It was quiet, like a museum at night. The asylum's records during that period are fragmented. An inspection by City Health Officer Dr. Marcus Langley, scheduled for April 7th, was cancelled without explanation. A note in the city's appointment book simply reads, Riched per Brandt. When Langley was later questioned, he recalled receiving a brief letter on Kingsbridge stationery claiming an outbreak of typhoid required the facility to be temporarily sealed off. He never saw the letter again. On April 10th, the Charleston Courier published a small notice in its back pages. Routine maintenance and disinfection at Kingsbridge Asylum to continue through April. Visitors postponed. No mention was made of staff changes, patient counts, or the sealed wing. The wording mimicked prior announcements about seasonal closures, though those typically lasted no more than 3 days. In mid-April, the grocer who had for years supplied bread and milk to the asylum grounds, Mr. Samuel Pickett, was instructed to leave future deliveries at the wooden booth by the east gate. When he tried to ask the young orderly who appeared briefly from behind the gate, the man spoke without lifting his head. "All further questions to Dr. Brandt," he said, before retreating back up the path. Pickett noticed that the booth's interior floor was slick, with what he assumed was brine or blood, though he could not be sure. Inside the asylum, according to a later testimony by a part-time laundress named Lydia Carr, changes were subtle but disturbing. She recalled being escorted to a different stairwell than usual and told to wash only linens marked with a red dot. When she asked about the new sorting method, her supervisor replied that it was on direct instruction from the doctor and should not be questioned. Carr described the sheets as stiff, not just from blood, which was not unusual, but from something tar-like and sour. She had worked in the asylum laundry for 6 years. "This wasn't patient mess," she said. "This was something they brought in, or something they used." By the 3rd week of April, the registry books had developed gaps. A visiting Presbyterian chaplain noted that his usual sign-in sheet was missing from the foyer. When he asked an attendant about the prayer service schedule, he was informed there would be no service that week. "They looked at me like I was late for a funeral," he later wrote in his diary. "Not angry, just finished." The chaplain was not allowed into the West Wing, though he had previously visited patients there twice monthly. The corridor connecting to Ward 6 had been closed off, with what he described as heavy wooden slats nailed across the frame, as though to hold something in, not out. He recalled a peculiar scent in the hallway, like soaked charcoal and something sharp, like pickled eggs. He left after a brief exchange with a junior orderly, who took his sermon pages without a word and disappeared behind the dining hall doors. Mrs. Tollison, the boarding house widow, continued to observe the asylum from across the marsh. She had once considered its lanterns in the evening a comfort, especially when the tides rose high. But in late April, the lights stopped. From her window, she could no longer make out the flicker of lamps through the dormitory windows, even when the sky was clear. "It was like someone pulled the life from it," she told a city investigator months later. "Like it died but forgot to fall down." On April 27th, a city intern named Harold Bellamy, recently assigned to the Records Division, attempted to reconcile hospital receipts with public disbursements. Among the files labeled KBA Receipts 1905, he found a stack of blank paper bundled with twine and marked Inventory. Between the empty pages, he discovered a crumpled note in a different hand than the official files. It read, "If you ask, they'll say it's rainwater. It isn't." Bellamy shared the note with his supervisor, who dismissed it as a joke. But Bellamy made a second discovery the following morning. The ledger for March and April 1906, which had previously been stored in Cabinet C14, was missing. In its place was a sealed envelope with Dr. Brandt's monogram. He was told not to open it. By the end of the week, Bellamy had been reassigned to port inventory tracking. What was clear by May was that not one citizen or clerk could account for who exactly was inside Kingsbridge Asylum. Patients were unseen, staff rarely emerged, and the West Wing, the one structure most isolated from view, remained dark behind slatted wood and padlocks, as if it had been carved out of the institution entirely. The name Eleanor Vassy was no longer mentioned, though her initials lingered on those medication logs in rooms that no longer appeared on maps of the building. In early May, the city's Public Institutions Committee received a letter from the Charleston chapter of the Temperance Union. Though the union typically concerned itself with the policing of saloons and the moral hygiene of waterfront neighborhoods, this letter diverged. Signed by Chairwoman Miriam Heath, it raised concerns over the abrupt cessation of correspondence from Kingsbridge Asylum, specifically referencing the charity sewing program the women had supported there since 1902. "Our last delivery of muslin gowns and winter shawls remains unacknowledged," Heath wrote. "Not a single nurse has replied, nor have we received the usual receipts." The committee shelved the letter with minimal discussion. That same week, the assistant janitor at the Charleston courthouse, a man named Ephraim Hill, came forward with a bundle of discarded documents he found behind the municipal incinerator chute. He brought them to his cousin, who worked nights at the city archives. Among the scorched edges and water-stained sheets was a partial list of asylum patients, last dated March 17, 1906. It contained 171 names, many of which were unfamiliar even to city clerks responsible for institutional oversight. 3 columns were marked: patient name, status, and notes. The final row read only, "Unnamed female, transferred, retain for study." The rest of the document was torn. On May 9th, a group of dock workers unloading crates at Vanderhorst's wharf noticed a man disembarking from a flat skiff wearing the dark grey uniform typical of King's Bridge attendants. He carried no luggage, but his boots and sleeves were smeared with a viscous yellowish paste. When a harbour official approached him to inquire about the unauthorized landing, the man offered no identification and merely stated he was there for salt procurement. After he disappeared into the alley behind Bay Street, he was not seen again. The harbour official filed a report with the city's health inspector, noting that the man's eyes were strangely wide, his skin pale to the point of translucence, and his demeanour as if reading something behind your face. He had carried a single satchel, which appeared stiff and damp. No requisition form for salt was ever filed by the asylum. Back at the city archives, young clerical assistant Margaret Eames had begun quietly cross-referencing the 1906 asylum reports with the city's census data. She noticed that of the 34 individuals reportedly admitted between February and April, only 12 had previous municipal records. The others had no birth entries, tax history, or familial ties. Several shared similar physical descriptions and generic names, John Black, Mary Reed, Thomas Miller, but varied wildly in supposed origin. One was listed as arriving from Pittsburgh, another from Mobile, another from within Charleston itself. Their intake notes were all written in the same hand, though initialed by 3 different staff members. Eames brought her findings to her superior, Mr. Elwell, but was told not to interfere in institutional internal methods. Undeterred, she shared her notes with a friend from church, Jonah Mullins, a law student and aspiring investigator who had begun compiling articles about corruption in city hospitals. He arranged to meet with her on May 15th outside the main post office. She did not arrive. When Mullins inquired at her boarding house, he was told she had gone to deliver papers to the East District office. She had left on foot in the direction of King's Bridge. The boarding house matron remembered her last words. She said she was going to check the East Gate. She said, "They can't fake all of it. Something in there has to be real." Mullins never saw her again. No missing person report was filed. By mid-May, a soft dread had taken hold among lower-level city staff. There were no formal orders issued, but word passed quietly. Don't ask about the asylum. Don't volunteer shifts near the marsh. Don't request archives from the health department labeled KBA. Requests made by mail went unanswered. In-person visits were turned away at the gate. The first internal memorandum to reference this silence came from the office of Mayor Leland Orton. Dated May 21, 1906, it was addressed to the Office of Sanitation. If the current supply records are accurate, King's Bridge should have received more milk than any other institution in the district this quarter. Please verify if this quantity is necessary for their actual census. The note was dry, bureaucratic, and detached, but it signaled something else, that someone in the mayor's office had noticed the numbers didn't match. On May 23rd, a city courier named Franklin Sims, known for his reliability and punctuality, returned from an attempted delivery to King's Bridge with his face unusually pale. According to his supervisor, Sims spoke only once about what happened. He described knocking at the East Gate booth and waiting as instructed. After nearly 20 minutes, the booth door opened slightly. Something was sitting inside, he said. Not someone. Something. He never elaborated. He quit the courier service that same afternoon and left Charleston entirely 2 days later. His final paycheck remained uncollected. Among the few remaining staff still willing to speak unofficially was Lydia Carr, the laundress. She reported that in the second week of May, her assigned delivery path had changed again. Instead of collecting soiled linens from the usual carts, she was instructed to retrieve them from a crate left in the empty chapel. The air was thick in there, she recalled, like molasses and rust. She noticed the crate bore no staff initials, no unit tags, only a red chalk X and the faint trace of mold. Inside, the linens were folded, but not washed. She recalled one particular item that disturbed her, a wool blanket stiff with a hard black crust along its edges. Embedded in the fabric was what she swore resembled a fingernail. When she reported this, her supervisor dismissed it. "If you want your pay, don't speculate," he said. By May 28th, the gasworks company noted a significant drop in output to the Kings Bridge meter, indicating an unexpected reduction in lighting and heating. This coincided with an uptick in requests for kerosene and lamp oil from nearby suppliers, though none bore official requisition slips. A blacksmith in the East District reported a request for 6 heavy padlocks and 2 custom iron braces, suitable for load-bearing doors. The buyer paid in cash, refused a receipt, and wore the insignia of a city health inspector, though the department denied any such transaction. On May 30th, a clerk in the municipal printer's office received a requisition form for 50 new patient file folders from Kings Bridge Asylum. The form bore the official seal and was signed by Dr. Brandt himself. It was dated June 2nd. The clerk, confused, showed it to his manager, who brushed it off as a clerical error. But the date remained, a form submitted 4 days before it was written. The manager instructed the clerk to hold it for verification. That night, the form vanished from the filing tray. No further requests came from Kings Bridge. The final known sighting of a non-staff individual on the asylum grounds occurred on the morning of May 31st. A fisherman named Abel Cortez, casting lines from the north edge of the marsh, observed 2 figures in white coats dragging a large, lumpy canvas sack from a side door near the garden wall. He described them as methodical, silent, and barefoot. They moved in rhythm, never looking up, and disappeared into the tree line where a small drainage path ran toward the deeper marshes. Cortez didn't approach. He didn't speak of it for weeks. "I knew what I saw," he later told a federal inspector in 1909, "but I also knew what happened to those who asked twice." By the start of June, the outer gates of Kings Bridge Asylum were fully locked. No smoke rose from the kitchen chimney. The booth at the east entrance remained closed, and no carts came down the old garden path. Inside, whatever records existed from April and May were never filed. The census book was last signed on March 30th, and still no one spoke of Eleanor Vassey. On the morning of June 5, 1906, Reverend Jonah Greer of the First Methodist Church received an unsigned note on thin yellowing paper slipped beneath his door. The message was written in charcoal, nearly illegible except for 2 words: "They're buried." Greer, a thin man with a nervous gait and a reputation for involving himself in civic matters others preferred to avoid, recognized the hand, not the name, but the frantic, jittered pressure of someone under duress. He had seen similar penmanship in confession slips left anonymously at the chapel's side altar. The note was folded around a torn fragment of linen, stained and brittle. He recognized the print pattern, the Temperance Union's custom-stitched bedgowns, donated only to Kings Bridge Asylum. 2 days later, Greer appeared before the Charleston Board of Health, requesting an unscheduled spiritual visitation to the asylum, citing pastoral concerns amid disturbing community murmurs. He was denied entry. The official reason, relayed by an assistant clerk, was increased isolation protocol. When Greer asked for clarification, the clerk retrieved a statement signed by Dr. Brandt stating the presence of unidentified microbial risk and institutional vulnerability to external agitation. Greer requested to speak to Dr. Brandt directly. The request was denied. That same week, Emery Candler, a newly assigned junior investigator with the Bureau of Institutional Oversight, was instructed to audit city-funded hospitals and care facilities between June and August. Charleston was one of his first postings. Candler, fresh from Savannah and eager to distinguish himself, requested full access to Kings Bridge records. What he received instead was a duplicate index catalogue, unbound and incomplete, mailed to him in a plain envelope postmarked not from Charleston, but from Somerville. The index listed only 8 active patients and 4 permanent staff. All 12 names appeared typed in a different font than the rest of the Bureau's materials. Candler noted that none of the listed patients matched known census data. The staff names included only Dr. Cornelius Brandt and 3 individuals with abbreviated surnames, HR, CV, and EV. He made an internal request to verify the identities of these individuals. The response he received 2 days later was brief. No personnel files available, records transferred to private custodianship. There was no explanation of what private custodianship meant. When he tried to escalate the issue to the Bureau's legal department, his request was flagged and rerouted to the mayor's office. Candler then decided to go to the asylum himself. His first impression of the grounds was unnerving. The surrounding marshland, once vibrant with reeds and birdsong, had grown unnaturally still. The air was heavy with a sour metallic odor that clung to his coat. Approaching the east gate, he noticed the booth unoccupied, its glass window cracked and smeared with a brownish residue. A faint, continuous clicking sound came from within the property, like tools striking stone at irregular intervals. He called out twice, no one responded. He circled the perimeter, taking notes. Near the northern fence, he found an old refuse pit partially filled with ash and broken glass. Poking from the edge was the corner of a wooden sign, scorched but still legible. Therapy Hall, Wing B. But Wing B had not been mentioned in any of the reports. Candler returned to his lodgings disturbed, but not yet alarmed. That changed the following morning when he opened his notebook and found several pages missing. Cleanly removed, not torn. Only one note remained: do not inquire through ordinary channels. By mid-June, Greer and Candler crossed paths through a mutual acquaintance, an elderly printer named Dunhill, who had once published medical pamphlets for Kingsbridge during its early years. Dunhill, now mostly blind, confirmed that the original floor plans of the asylum included at least 3 wings not found on any of the city's current maps. "They didn't remove them," he said. "They just stopped listing them." He recalled once printing an internal guide for new hires, sometime around 1889. There was a page about internal reporting, patient speech irregularities, protocols for unconsented silence. It had a whole column labeled non-verifiables. I didn't know what it meant then. Still don't. Candler obtained a partial copy of that pamphlet from the archives of the Charleston Medical College. It was brittle and redacted with ink, but 2 phrases stood out in bold type: confined without external ledger entry, and temporary possession of anatomical discrepancies. He presented the document to the Bureau in Charleston. Within 2 days, his audit was suspended pending reassignment. He received no further explanation. His credentials were revoked, and his correspondence ceased. Greer, meanwhile, attempted to summon public attention. He prepared a sermon referencing the note, the missing names, and what he called a silence organized by human hands. He invited the press. Only 3 parishioners attended. The church's front gate was found open the following morning, the lectern splintered, and a dead crow placed on the pulpit. On June 18th, a woman named Cora Ellington arrived at the Bureau of Vital Statistics. She claimed to be the sister of Eleanor Vassy. Soft-spoken, with hands chapped from laundering, she carried an old daguerreotype of Eleanor as a girl. "She's not dead," she told the clerk, "but she's not somewhere you can reach by train." Cora had received no letter, no telegram, no acknowledgement of Eleanor's service since early March. When she attempted to inquire directly at Kingsbridge, she was turned away. A man behind the gate told her, "All those who remain here do so by their own designation." Cora asked what that meant. The man shut the gate. She now demanded official recognition of Eleanor's status. The Bureau listed her as employed unconfirmed, no certificate of termination, no record of release. When Cora asked to file a missing person request, the clerk hesitated, then stated, "That jurisdiction is currently sealed for institutional privacy." Cora returned home and was not seen again. Journalist Luther Hatch of the Charleston Ledger began investigating Candler's reassignment. His notes, preserved in the Ledger's archives, show he tracked discrepancies in the asylum's supply routes, notably the arrival of deliveries with no outgoing waste. One invoice from May 1906 listed 50 sacks of flour and 4 barrels of salt. No corresponding refuse or spoiled goods were recorded. He requested access to asylum disposal logs. He was denied. Hatch visited the Charleston Water Treatment Office, where he spoke with an operator named Rolfe Gentry. Gentry mentioned that runoff from the Kings Bridge drainage pipe had begun producing unusual sediment, dark flakes with a greenish sheen, slick to the touch and resistant to dissolving in lye. He had sent samples to the county lab. The samples disappeared in transit. On June 25th, Hatch attempted to visit the asylum posing as a medical volunteer. He brought a forged form signed by a retired physician. At the gate, a staff member accepted the form without comment and disappeared for nearly half an hour. When he returned, he handed Hatch a sealed envelope. Inside was a single note typed in red ink. "The record you seek has been sealed by his own consent." Hatch did not understand what this meant. He left the grounds and never returned. His final article appeared 3 days later, a brief column titled, "Where the Records End." It ran on page 5. The editor received a formal warning from the Municipal Communications Board for escalating unverified rumor. By the end of June, 3 facts remained unchanged. The number of registered patients had not been updated since March 30th. No city official had physically entered the premises since April 3rd, and Kings Bridge Asylum, once a source of pride and order, had grown entirely silent behind its locked iron gates. The beginning of July brought a stretch of dry heat that settled heavily over Charleston. The marsh around Kings Bridge shrank back from the banks, revealing long-forgotten debris, rusted tools, fractured fence posts, and a series of small wooden markers poking through the mud, each no larger than a brick. No names, no dates, just weather-worn shapes half swallowed by silt. The local children, warned off by their parents, stopped playing along the eastern footpath. On July 3rd, a telegraph arrived at the office of the South Carolina Medical Board in Columbia. It came from a man identifying himself as Dr. Peter Marlin, claiming to have been employed at Kings Bridge Asylum in the year 1898. The message was cryptic. "Records doctored, bodies relocated. Brant is not accountable to the board." There was no return address. Attempts to trace the message through regional offices failed. The only doctor. Marlin, licensed in the state, had died in 1902. 2 days later, the medical board's acting secretary, Thomas Weller, dispatched an inquiry to Charleston's public health office, requesting verification of Dr. Brant's current licensure and facility certifications. The reply was swift but incomplete. Brant was confirmed as director, but the licensing information had been removed from the central register. A handwritten note in the margin read, "See File B17, Custody Restricted." Weller requested access to the restricted file. His request was denied on the grounds of legislative redirection. No explanation was offered for what this redirection entailed. Meanwhile, an unexpected visitor arrived in Charleston. Professor Alan Thresher, an anthropologist from Yale University, conducting a study on institutional architecture in the American South. His research had brought him to Charleston by way of Savannah, and he'd heard references to Kings Bridge in a collection of student essays archived at the Charleston Athenaeum. What intrigued him was a sketch labeled "Internal Arc, Observation Port," with no corresponding record in any known asylum blueprint. Thresher wrote to Dr. Brant requesting permission to tour the facility. He received no reply. Still driven by professional curiosity, he arranged to walk the perimeter of the property on July 6th. His field notes, later recovered by a colleague, described the asylum's northern elevation as disturbingly symmetrical, like a duplicate of itself, mirroring without explanation. He noted that windows on the 3rd floor were shuttered from within, though ventilation would have been necessary during the heat. He also recorded the scent of old lye, eggshells, and bruised iron. The following day, he attempted to document the layout using a Kodak camera. 3 exposures failed. The 4th, taken facing the west wing, developed with an unusual smudge across the lower corner, obscuring the ground-level window he swore had been open at the time. He left Charleston abruptly on July 9th and returned to New Haven. His final telegram to the Athenaeum simply read, "Structure not logical. Presence of double corridors confirmed. Caution." Within the Charleston courthouse, civil servant Beatrice Lyle, responsible for logging property inspections, noticed a backlog of unresolved reports pertaining to Kingsbridge. There were at least 7 open work orders from March and April, plumbing irregularities, collapsed flooring in the supply wing, and one classified as uncontrolled seepage. None had been closed, and none bore the names of responding contractors. Lyle attempted to contact 2 local companies listed on earlier service records. One had gone out of business in May, the other denied ever working with the asylum. Yet invoices remained, signed and paid. On July 12th, Reverend Greer published a leaflet titled Doctrine of Forgetting, in which he referenced an institution that consumes its own shadow to remain whole. The tract was poetic, almost opaque, but those familiar with his recent sermons understood. Within a week, Greer was suspended from clerical duties pending mental health review. The hospital to which he was admitted did not list him as a patient. His name vanished from church rosters, and parishioners were advised not to speak of him publicly. Around this time, a fisherman from Folly Island, Robert Little, reported a strange encounter while navigating the Ashley River's side channels near the asylum grounds. He claimed to have seen a man standing waist-deep in the water, unmoving, facing the current. His clothes were hospital issue, the kind Little had seen during deliveries years earlier. When Little called out, the man didn't turn. Instead, he slowly raised one hand and pointed inland, toward the asylum's rear wall. The tide shifted quickly that morning. Little's boat capsized 15 minutes later. He survived but refused to return to the area. When he told his story at a tavern that evening, a city official sitting nearby took his name and later filed a report titled Delirium Statement, July 14th. The report was archived, then quietly destroyed 2 weeks later. By mid-July, the heat turned unbearable. Black tar melted along roof seams and livestock collapsed in shaded barns. Reports of illnesses increased, particularly among municipal workers stationed near the East District. A pattern emerged: dizziness, headaches, persistent nosebleeds. The source was attributed to stagnant water or spoiled produce, but 2 sanitation officers noted that every case had occurred within 1 mile of the Kingsbridge perimeter. The officers requested masks and additional patrol shifts to identify the cause. Their request was denied. One was reassigned to the docks. The other resigned. Inside the Office of Building Records, an anonymous envelope was received on July 18th. Inside was a single map, an original site plan for Kingsbridge Asylum, dated 1879. What made it remarkable were the annotations, small red marks along the western corridor, and a long looping arrow from the main dormitory to a structure labeled Unregistered Containment, Not for Census. The mark bore the initials CB. The clerk who opened the envelope, Milton Sharp, brought the map to his supervisor. The next day, Sharp was transferred to Columbia. No explanation was given. The envelope was not seen again. At the Charleston Athenaeum, a visiting historian named Irena Powell began investigating old municipal contracts from the postbellum period. She uncovered a payment log from 1885 referencing institutional reinforcement, Charleston Marshlands. The recipient was not listed as Kingsbridge Asylum, but as CBR Holdings. She found no corporation by that name in the registry, but she did find, buried in an 1886 ledger, a line item marked Site Preparation Subterranean. Powell attempted to follow the trail further, but encountered resistance. Access to certain files was suddenly restricted. Her reading room privileges were suspended, and she was asked to leave the City Archives building. That evening, her lodging was searched without a warrant. Her notes, though partially preserved, were later found smudged with what appeared to be lye and ink. On July 21st, the city's chief recorder, Edwin Ferrell, addressed the Public Institutions Committee in a closed-door session. He cited unaccounted funds, conflicting census data, and a complete breakdown in internal communication regarding Kingsbridge Asylum. His remarks were transcribed but not published. Witnesses reported that he appeared visibly shaken. 1 week later, Ferrell announced his retirement, effective immediately. As July drew to a close, Kingsbridge Asylum appeared unchanged. The grass remained short. The gates remained locked. Smoke no longer rose from any chimney, yet the city continued to process supply receipts. No official had stepped inside since April. No citizen dared approach. The records for June and July contained no entries, no new admissions, no discharges, and no trace of Eleanor Vassy. It was August 2nd, 1906, when the breach finally occurred, not through official orders or legal force, but by accident, during a summer storm that flooded parts of Charleston's marsh perimeter and caused a section of the eastern fence at Kingsbridge Asylum to collapse inward. A group of sanitation workers, dispatched to inspect storm drains along the city's edge, stumbled across the damage. Among them was Charles Dempsey, a veteran pipe surveyor known for his precision and refusal to exaggerate. He noted the breach in his log and, in defiance of his supervisor's caution, entered the asylum grounds through the gap. The marsh was silent. No birdsong, no wind. The ground squelched underfoot with a sticky pull, as if something clung to the soles of their boots. They approached the rear of the facility, where the boiler building and the old infirmary wing connected by a narrow enclosed walkway. The glass along the corridor was blackened, some panes fractured from the inside. No movement. Dempsey called out, but the only response was the low creak of warped wood under heat. The group advanced cautiously. One of them, Elias Dent, slipped on a patch of oily residue near a drainage grate. As he steadied himself, he noticed something lodged between the iron slats, fabric. Dempsey bent to examine it and pulled free a strip of coarse linen stitched with faded red thread. At the edge was a hand-sewn initial, V. Inside the infirmary wing, the door was ajar. The interior reeked of ammonia and mildew. Dust hung thick in the air, disturbed only by the workers' steps and the occasional shift of beams overhead. The main hallway was lined with rows of identical rooms, their doors uniformly closed. Dempsey opened the first one on the left. It was empty, save for a rust-stained bed frame, a wash basin, and a chair facing the corner. No mattress, no personal effects. On the wall, etched faintly into the plaster, was a repeating pattern of vertical lines, 5, then 4, then 6. He counted them out loud. No one responded. 2 rooms down, they found what they later referred to in reports as the archive chamber. It was a small office, its contents still mostly intact, though water damage had claimed several boxes along the back wall. On the desk was a ledger, open to a brittle page dated March 1906. The entries listed patient numbers without names. Alongside each were brief notes: non-compliant, unable to transfer, no further response. One final entry read, reduced to presence, no return. A locked cabinet in the corner bore the nameplate, C. Brandt. They forced it open with a pipe tool. Inside were folders, many blank, others with only partial documentation. No charts, no signatures. Tucked between 2 manila covers was a hand-drawn map, far more detailed than any municipal blueprint. It showed sublevels beneath the west wing. 3 descending chambers labeled observation, extraction, and storage. Dempsey copied the map into his field book, knowing instinctively that this would not survive official processing. They descended into the lower corridor. The staircase to the sublevel was made of concrete, slick with condensation and worn along the edges. A bare bulb flickered at the base, its wire snapped and hanging loose. The air grew colder, sharply metallic. Below, the tiles changed from hexagonal to rectangular. The walls were damp. The silence felt pressed inward, as if sound itself had been removed. The first room they entered had no label. It contained 6 metal tables, each fitted with iron restraints, the leather dried and cracked. Along the far wall stood a row of cabinets filled with identical glass jars, each labeled with codes rather than names. Inside, some were tissue samples suspended in a thick yellowish gel. Others were empty, but bore residue and the faint outlines of something once stored. A clipboard hung beside the entry, listing dates from 1897 to 1905. The final line was blank except for a red dot. To the right of the chamber, a narrow corridor sloped gently downward. As they progressed, a strange sound became audible, faint at first, then more distinct. It was a rhythmic clinking like glass tapping metal. The source was a large room at the corridor's end, partially caved in, lit by one remaining oil lamp still flickering weakly on the floor. Inside were rows of wooden shelves, half collapsed, covered in mold and rot. Each shelf had been labeled once, but the ink had bled into illegibility. Scattered across the floor were dozens of patient records, many stripped of identifying details. One folder lay open near the threshold, the name inside Eleanor Vassy. Her intake date matched the payroll logs, but her status line had been crossed out and rewritten. First, active duty. Then ASYLUM Subject 3. In the center of the room was a large metal bin, sealed by a rusted hatch. It was chained shut. The lock bore a serial number from the Charleston Naval Yard, despite no record of military involvement in the asylum. Dempsey marked it, then motioned to return above. On their ascent, one of the workers, Walter Haynes, paused outside a chamber marked cold storage. The door was swollen shut. It took all three to force it open. Inside was a refrigerated room lined with steel drawers. Some were open, revealing cloth-wrapped forms no longer identifiable as bodies. The air was unbearable, acrid, suffocating, and wrong. Dempsey later described it as like scorched feathers and seawater left too long in the sun. At the far end of the room stood a single upright examination table. Strapped to it was what remained of a uniform, the name patch partially legible, Nurse Vass. The cloth had fused to the surface. No flesh remained. Dempsey pulled his men out. Back above ground, they emerged into the overgrown garden behind the west wing. There, beneath a collapsed trellis, they uncovered a hatch partially obscured by ivy and debris. The hinges were intact, but sealed by layers of pitch and gravel. They marked the location, took photographs, and retreated through the breach before nightfall. The report filed by Dempsey was intercepted within hours of submission. His superior, Gerald Fess, later admitted to being contacted directly by a city official who ordered the entire file rerouted for emergency classification. No copies were returned. The map was never recovered. Dempsey was placed on indefinite leave. The following day, a black carriage arrived at the eastern access road to Kingsbridge Asylum. Witnesses described 4 men in dark suits entering the property without announcement. They remained for just under 3 hours. When they left, they carried no files, no evidence, no crates. Only a single, sealed envelope. Within 48 hours, the breach in the fence had been repaired. In the early hours of August 4th, the Charleston Marsh Drainage Authority initiated an unannounced maintenance sweep following the storm's disruptions. Among the personnel assigned was engineer Thomas Liu, a methodical, soft-spoken man who preferred solitary work along less trafficked canals. At approximately 5:15 a.m., while inspecting an outlet beneath the old salt line parallel to the asylum's property, he noticed a trickle of cloudy water pooling unnaturally against the drainage wall. He traced it back to a rusted culvert pipe that should have been sealed since 1895. It was not. Prying it open with a trench spade, Liu uncovered a narrow passage thick with moss and the scent of stagnant bile. The pipe extended westward, directly beneath the asylum. Against protocol, he crawled in. He made it 20 yards before retreating, coughing violently. In his report, he described the air inside the pipe as heavy with something old, like mildew on bone, but layered with heat. At the end of the section he explored, Liu found a series of leather straps nailed to the tunnel wall, some still holding the fragments of what appeared to be patient restraint cuffs. No bodies, no prints, just silence and water that did not drain. By noon, Liu's discovery had reached 2 municipal offices. Both filed copies of his report. Within 48 hours, both copies were missing. When Liu returned to check the culvert on August 6th, the pipe had been welded shut and painted over. A new drainage marker had been installed reading, "Access restricted, gas risk." He never spoke of it again. That same afternoon, following persistent urging from a growing group of reformists within the Charleston Health Bureau, a reluctant joint inspection was scheduled for the following Monday. Led by Deputy Supervisor Myron Keel, the team was tasked with verifying the existence and condition of patient records, census data, and structural compliance. Keel, an aging bureaucrat with little taste for conflict, had for years avoided questions about Kingsbridge. But the noise around the asylum had grown too large to dismiss. His superiors insisted on an appearance of oversight. On August 9th, under a bruised sky, Keel arrived at the East Gate with 3 clerks, a health registrar and a stenographer. The gate was unlocked, the booth abandoned. A single lantern burned on the windowsill, its flame enclosed by soot. The silence of the grounds struck Keel immediately. Even the wind through the tall grass carried no sound. The path to the main entrance had been cleared of debris, though the garden beyond was wild and overgrown. The main building stood still, windows were shuttered from within. The door creaked open with a dry groan, revealing the same interior noted by Dempsey's team. Dust-thick air, a heavy scent of decay, and rooms that mirrored each other in unnatural symmetry. Keel's clerk, Frances Ellaby, noted in her log that each door they passed was identical in dimension and placement, as though built to disorient. They found no patients. Each room held the imprint of occupation, worn blankets, half-burnt candles, rust-rimmed basins, but not one body. Even the infirmary wing was empty, its hallways darkened by soot along the upper corners, as if a fire had burned slowly, then stopped itself. On the wall outside what had once been the medication room was a list of treatment dates ending abruptly on March 30th. Below that, someone had scrawled in faint pencil, "Reversal successful. Retain only volunteers." Keel demanded entry to the west wing. The door was locked, reinforced with new iron braces. A set of keys found in Dr. Brandt's vacant office fit the top latch but not the lower two. They proceeded to the basement, using the copied map from Dempsey's notes, smuggled and hand-transcribed by a sympathetic staff member before the originals vanished. The descent into the sublevel was slower this time. With lanterns in hand, they passed the same tiled halls, the same steel-doored chambers marked without names. In one room labeled Containment 3, the walls were lined with copper tubing, some capped, others leaking thin trails of brackish fluid. The floor bore scratches, deep and angular, crossing in odd concentric patterns. In the adjacent chamber, behind a reinforced pane of smeared glass, they found what Keel later described in a sealed affidavit as the remnants of systematic reduction. A shallow pit had been dug into the floor. Inside were layers of ash, scorched bone fragments, and twisted iron restraints. No record identified its function. A blackboard nearby listed codes in chalk: H27, D9, and EVS. The latter was circled twice. The team paused when they reached the final corridor. At its end was the sealed hatch Dempsey had marked weeks earlier. Though the pitch had hardened, Keel's team came prepared. They chipped away the sealant, working in silence. When the hatch groaned open, a gust of cold chemical air surged upward. They descended one by one. The chamber was round, far below ground level, its walls lined with shelving covered in tarps. In the center stood a single iron slab, bolted to the concrete. Chains lay loosely at either end. No documents, no tools, but the walls bore faint impressions, drawings made in soot and nail scratches. They depicted human figures with parts erased, redrawn, reshaped. One panel showed two identical faces joined at the neck. Another showed a torso stretched by vertical lines. A small metal box sat beneath the slab. Inside were tags, dozens of them, each marked with initials and dates. Many were unreadable. The last tag was clearer. It read, Vasi E, 330. On the back was a single word, resolved. Keel ordered the chamber sealed. He made his team swear silence until official channels were notified. They climbed out in near darkness, hands marked by dust and rust, lungs thick with air that didn't clear. By the time they reached the surface, the storm had returned. Rain fell hard against the glass roof, turning the garden path into a strip of mud. At the front entrance, Keel found an envelope pinned to the door with a rusted nail. It bore the city seal, though none of his team had placed it there. Inside was a single sheet of official stationery. No name, no date, only a sentence. The census has been adjusted to reflect available memory. He kept the note. He burned it 2 weeks later. The official report, filed August 11th, was brief. It listed minor structural concerns, a temporary closure due to administrative transition, and no current patient occupancy. No mention was made of the sublevels, the tags, or the sealed hatch. Keel's original draft disappeared after submission. When he returned to request a copy, the clerk told him it had never been received. 3 days later, Kings Bridge Asylum was permanently removed from the city's active institutional registry. It was not listed as condemned. It was not marked as closed. It simply ceased to be referenced. By late August, the grass had grown over the east gate path. The booth remained, its windows blackened, its door nailed shut. No new sightings were reported. No new names entered the public records. The lantern in the booth, when seen from the marsh path at night, no longer burned. And the name Eleanor Vassy would not appear again in any Charleston record. On September 1, 1906, the Charleston Board of Institutions convened a closed session under the pretext of budget reallocations for the fiscal year. The topic of Kings Bridge Asylum was not listed on the docket. Yet inside the chamber, behind locked doors and blacked-out transom windows, it became the sole subject of discussion for more than 5 hours. The minutes of that meeting were never published. The stenographer assigned to the session, a junior clerk named Lena Wright, resigned her post the following week and left the city entirely. Her letter of resignation contained no explanation, only a single line: "I won't bear the sound of what I now remember." On September 8th, the city issued a single-page decree under the seal of the mayor's office. Kingsbridge institutional grounds are henceforth designated for restricted administrative. Storage use. Public access is prohibited. Facility oversight will be transferred to interim custodianship pending federal review. No department claimed responsibility for the review, and no interim custodian was named. The following day, the iron gates were welded shut. No arrests were made, no trials were held. The name of Dr. Cornelius Brandt did not appear in any newspaper, court proceeding, or public address. He had vanished entirely from the professional registry, his medical license file marked "withdrawn by request." A search for his residence turned up an empty house on Lawrence Street, neatly arranged, pantry stocked, fireplace swept, and no sign of recent departure. A single coat remained on the hook by the door, pockets lined with ash. Reverend Jonah Greer was released from the private hospital on the outskirts of Columbia on September 12th. He returned to Charleston unannounced, thin and disoriented, carrying only a copy of the 1889 institutional guide he had once quoted from his pulpit. He refused to speak publicly. When asked what he had learned, he simply replied, "They didn't need to hide the truth. They just let it rot." Greer was found dead in his boarding room on October 3rd. No foul play was recorded. The cause was listed as stroke. His effects included a box of sermon drafts, a single rusted key, and an unopened envelope addressed to "whomever still looks." Meanwhile, the building that had housed the asylum stood untouched. Its windows remained shuttered, its corridors dark. City maintenance crews avoided the property. When storm runoff once again threatened the surrounding marshland in late October, the usual sandbag deliveries were cancelled. An entire zone of the city's eastern map was redrawn to exclude the site from flood modelling. In private meetings, the Board of Institutions approved the redistribution of Kingsbridge budget funds to other care facilities in the state, though not one of them received the full allotment. A portion of the funds, exactly $1,800, was redirected to the Department of Municipal Sanitation for chemical processing equipment. No equipment was delivered. The receipt trail ended at a warehouse near the waterfront that was later condemned for structural collapse. Inside, nothing remained but a ledger signed EV. By November, the local press had ceased any mention of the asylum. The Charleston Courier ran a column on hospital reform that excluded Kingsbridge entirely. The Charleston Ledger, once vocal on the matter, began publishing poetry in the same column where Luther Hatch had submitted his final report. When asked why, the editor replied, "The public prefers forgetfulness to answers." Despite this, there were pockets of resistance. Cora Ellington, the last known relative of Eleanor Vassy to come forward, petitioned the city court for a public inquest. Her request was denied twice on procedural grounds. On her third attempt, she was told the petition had never been received. She later confronted a clerk at City Hall with her signed confirmation notice. The clerk did not deny its existence. Instead, she handed Cora a sealed envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph of a darkened hallway, a single chair facing the wall, and a name scrawled across the back in pencil: L. Cora left Charleston 3 days later, and never returned. During the winter of 1906, the ground around Kingsbridge froze unusually early. Workers repairing the railway bridge nearby reported frost patterns across the eastern embankment, even on days without low temperatures. One man, digging a trench for utility lines, unearthed a rusted tag marked Patient 114 Partial. When he brought it to the city office, the clerk told him no such patient existed. The tag was never seen again. Professor Alan Thresher at Yale submitted his research findings to the Southern Journal of Institutional Architecture in December. His paper, titled Symmetry and Discontinuity in Post-Reconstruction Facilities, included detailed sketches of the Kingsbridge grounds and a theory that the building had been constructed with deliberate omissions: corridors without endpoints, wings without access points, structural designs that facilitated concealment rather than care. The journal declined to publish it, citing insufficient supporting documentation. Thresher left academia the following spring. The physical structure of Kingsbridge remained standing through the turn of the decade. Its roof sagged, its windows blackened. Weeds overtook the walkways, still no graffiti appeared on its walls. No broken glass, no looting. As if the town had made an unspoken agreement to leave it untouched. In 1909, a citywide institutional audit was conducted under federal order, part of a broader effort to reform public health oversight across the South. Charleston's submission omitted Kingsbridge entirely. When asked by a federal agent about the omission, the responding officer replied, "That facility was decommissioned under special directive." When pressed for a copy of the directive, the agent received a folder containing only blank pages and a sealed vial labeled Undated Sample 6B. Later that year, the Federal Oversight Commission restructured the Charleston Public Institutions Board. 6 members were replaced. No reason was offered. Their final meeting notes, now archived in Columbia, include a single sentence scribbled at the margin of an unrelated budget page. They made record from silence. By 1910, most who had served at Kingsbridge had moved, died, or disappeared. A few surface mentions occurred in city property records, usually in the form of redacted citations. The official city map labeled the area only as preserved land, future use undetermined. The building was never demolished. The surrounding marsh crept closer year by year. Today the site remains fenced and locked, though the city claims no ownership. And sometimes, after rain, the lowland air carries the faint scent of lavender soap. By the spring of 1911, the Kingsbridge property had passed into a kind of quiet mythology. It was not spoken of in city chambers or referenced in public health briefings. But within the families of those who had worked near it, or lost someone within it, the name remained, softly uttered, never explained. Parents discouraged children from walking the marsh trails. Fishermen avoided anchoring near the old service docks. The building still stood, but its presence was like a void, unchallenged, unacknowledged, unmoved. A resolution drafted by State Assemblyman Richard A. Moore proposed repurposing abandoned institutional lands for agriculture. Among the parcels listed in the accompanying appendix was Tract 47E, Eastern Perimeter, Charleston County. A handwritten line in the margin of the proposal had been crossed out several times but was still legible beneath the ink. It read, "Bridge site, no soil use, advised sterile." The resolution passed, but Tract 47E was never cultivated. Surveyors who inspected the area reported that plant life near the foundation line of the old asylum either failed to grow or exhibited strange abnormalities. Cornstalks grew sideways. Roots curled above the soil. Even wild grasses appeared desaturated, a pale shade that refused to green with spring. In an unpublished letter to a colleague at the University of Virginia, a botanist named Mary Estlin described a sample of moss scraped from the inner gate wall of the facility. "The texture is coarse, almost crystalline," she wrote. "The smell is unfamiliar. Not unpleasant, but wrong in a way I cannot place. It doesn't rot and it resists boiling." She sent the sample to a laboratory in New York for further testing. The shipment never arrived. Months later, she received a single postcard with no return address. It read, "Your work is noted. We advise closure." In July of that year, a Charleston librarian named Seth Ward began compiling a private index of missing public documents across the state's institutions from 1895 to 1907. He found over 400 gaps, entries with no corresponding paperwork, payments without recipient signatures, admission records ending mid-sentence. Of those, 73 were linked directly to Kingsbridge Asylum. Ward's interest became obsession. He ceased his work at the library and began living among old court archives and abandoned printing offices, piecing together what he called the Hollow Decade. His final entry, written on loose ledger paper, was brief. They indexed their absence. We let them. He died in December of that year, reportedly of a sudden hemorrhage. His papers were confiscated by city authorities for review and consolidation. None were returned. In oral accounts recorded decades later by the Charleston Historical Society, elderly residents recalled strange activity at the site during the winter of 1911. Men in unmarked coats arrived at dusk and left before sunrise. No wagons, no horses, just the slow echo of footfalls on frost-hardened ground. One resident, then a child, remembered watching through a knothole in a fence as men carried long canvas-wrapped forms from the west wall to the marsh edge, where the ground dipped into a natural basin. She never saw the forms return. These events were never formally recorded. No permits were filed. No public notices were given. In 1912, a final clerical attempt was made to register the Kingsbridge structure for historical preservation under a proposed initiative to safeguard Reconstruction-era architecture. The application was submitted by a graduate student from Columbia. It was rejected, not for lack of merit, but because the registry claimed the building had never existed in any official capacity. The student's source documents were seized for misuse of institutional names. Years passed. The surrounding area was slowly absorbed by shifting property lines and quiet purchases under shell entities. By 1918, even the foundation was obscured by overgrowth. The building itself stood, reduced to its bones, stone and soot, surrounded by still water and the smell of rust. Occasionally, a hunter or surveyor would report stumbling upon its perimeter. The reports always read the same: silence, scent, symmetry, and then nothing. In 1920, a Charleston teacher named Annabelle Harris compiled a series of essays from her 8th grade class on the subject of places no longer here. One child's essay stood out. It described a building with walls that hummed, doors that mirrored each other, like eyes watching each other sleep, and a long hallway that ended in a chair facing the wall. The child claimed their grandfather had once been a cook there. He says the people there weren't sick, they were quiet, too quiet, and then they weren't people anymore. Harris tried to follow up with the family, but was told they had moved north suddenly, leaving no address. In the decades that followed, Kingsbridge Asylum faded from official knowledge. It appeared in no textbooks, no preservation records, no maps. But in Charleston, its absence became its own story, told not in what was said, but in what was left out. Buildings that resembled its wings were demolished without fanfare. Photographs that included its outline were retouched, or misattributed, or filed under different names. Even among archivists, the subject grew evasive. Catalogue drawers labeled KB were sometimes found empty. Shelves once filled with mental health reports bore blank file slips. The index cards stopped at K. Today, nothing of Kingsbridge remains in the city's official record. But in the marsh, if the tide is low and the light angled just right, a faint path can still be seen winding through the reeds, and near its end, a rusted post leans outward, marked with 3 carved letters, deep, crooked, and unmistakable. EVS. If this story moved you, if you made it to the end, it's because you also feel that these hidden truths must come to light. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. That way we'll know how far these stories reach, and subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering them. This story was reconstructed from documents that were found. All names have been changed to protect the source.